Afternoon, and welcome to Evergreen Lessons of the Iraq War 20 years later. My name is Kelly Vlahos, and I am a senior advisor for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is sponsoring this very special panel today. As you know, on this day 20 years ago, the United States launched an invasion beginning with precision missile strikes on targets in Baghdad, followed by the deployment of 160,000 coalition troops into the country. What followed was not all expected. A serious power vacuum after Saddam Hussein's overthrow, a bloody sectarian insurgency, the proliferation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, followed by ISIS. Some 4,600 US troops died over the course of the decade, along with tens of thousands wounded, many with lifetime injuries, while Brown University's Watson Institute estimates that between 275,000 to 306,000 Iraqi civilians were killed. No WNMDs, the official justification for the war, were ever found. Why were Congress and the American public so easily misled in the lead up to the 2003 invasion? Has anything changed since then that would make it less likely for this to happen again? What are the long-term consequences of this invasion? Why are US troops still in Iraq 20 years later? What is the legacy of the US invasion in Iraq, and what does a post-American Iraq look like? Here we have an esteemed panel of experts who each bring something different to the table. I'm going to introduce them and then hand things off to our moderator, Adam Weinstein. Marcin Alshamari is an assistant professor of political science at Boston College. She is also a research fellow at the Middle East Initiative at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs with the Harvard Kennedy School, and a non-resident fellow with the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, where she was a postdoctoral research fellow from 20 to 21. She is currently working on her book manuscript, A Century of the Iraqi Hausa: How Clerics Shaped Protests and Politics in Modern Day Iraq. Steve Simon is senior research analyst at the Quincy Institute and the Robert Wilhelm Fellow at the MIT Center for International Studies. Prior to this, he was executive director for the International Institute for Strategic Studies for the US and Middle East. From 2001 to 2012, he served on the National Security Council staff as senior director for Middle Eastern and North African affairs. He also worked on the NSC staff from 94 to 99 on counterterrorism and Middle East security policy. His most recent book, The Long Goodbye, the United States and the Middle East from the Islamic Revolution to the Arab Spring, will be published this spring. Michael Hanlon is a senior fellow and director of research and foreign policy at the Brookings Institution, which he specializes in US defense strategy, the use of military force, and American national security policy. He co-directs the Security and Strategy Team, the Defense Industrial Base Working Group, and the Africa Security Initiative within the Foreign Policy Program as well. He is adjunct professor at Columbia, Georgetown, and Syracuse Universities. And his most recent book, Military History for the Modern Strategist: America's Major Wars Since 1861, was published in January of this year. Adam Weinstein is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute, focused on security, trade, and rule of law in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Middle East. Adam previously worked for KPMG's international trade practice and as senior law and policy analyst at the National Iranian American Council, where he focused on the securitization of US immigration policy and its effect on immigrant communities. He is also a non-resident fellow at Tabadlab, an Islamabad-based think tank and advisory firm. Adam also served as a US Marine in Afghanistan in 2012. So I am very excited for this discussion, and I would be remiss if I did not mention that Steve and Adam just released a very prescient brief for Quincy entitled "You Can Go Home Again: A Proposal for Phased Military Withdrawal from Iraq and Normalizing US-Iraq Relations," which I'm sure they will be infusing into their comments today. And you can check it out on the front page of the QI website. So I'm going to hand this over to you, Adam, and I'll be back at the end of the hour to close the proceedings.
Thanks a lot for that, Kelly. Thanks to all the guests for joining. I see we have a really high attendance today for this talk, and I think it deserves that. I just want to start by going around and just briefly asking you all, where were you on the eve of the invasion, just so we can humanize this a little bit. Mine is not very interesting. I think I was in 8th grade in the United States. Maybe I'll start with Marcin.
Adam, I was also in middle school in Minnesota in March, and in June 2003, I actually visited Iraq for the first time since I was born there, having left when I was 3.
How about you next, Michael?
Well, I'm a little older than you two. I was already well ensconced in my Brookings career, and I think I was at home. There'd been, as you know, a longstanding debate about whether and how to wage this conflict. I was trying to be a responsible participant in that debate. I'm sure we'll talk about some of the various ideas that were being, kicked around and developed back then. But I was very locked into the debate and watching from television in a comfortable Washington, D.C. suburb.
And last but not least, Stephen.
I had just returned to the States from my last State Department assignment, which was in London. I'd been there for a number of years, during which I co-edited a book with Toby Dodge of the London School of Economics. I'm not sure that was where he was then, called Iraq in the Shadow of Regime Change, which essentially anticipated much of the mayhem that actually took place once combat operations had taken place.
Okay, so I guess let's start this conversation from the U.S. perspective for a moment, and I'll stick with you here, Steve. What do you think generally the legacy of the Iraq War is for the United States today?
It's a tricky question because you need to think of whether we're talking about Iraq as a legacy of the war on terror in that context or on its own, and whether we're talking about the short run or long run legacies. So I'm not. So anyway, I'm going to take a stab at this, despite the ambiguities. I think the two main longer-term legacies are in the geopolitical domain, the empowerment of Iran. I think, that's obviously still with us. We grapple with it every day. And that was a direct consequence of the war and a continuing legacy of it. The other is the accumulation of domestic debt. That's a matter of public finance, but it will be with us for a while in the form of among other things, interest that's accrued on the trillions that were borrowed to fight the war in Iraq. Now, the United States has nearly a $25 trillion GDP. Doesn't sound like a lot. That is the $3 trillion of the war. Doesn't sound like a lot relative to the size of the U.S. GDP, but still, given crises that the United States faces now, whether it's in terms of economic bailouts or inflation reduction or its climate change, those trillions would be nice to have right now. Now, there are other legacies as well. The one is the militarization of domestic policing, including the transformation of community policing into counterinsurgency operations. I think that's a lasting legacy. The fueling of militia culture in the U.S., I think is also a lasting legacy. In other respects, I don't think there's very much that's lasting. Peter Feaver, just wrote a piece that's a bit controversial in Foreign Affairs, in which he argues, I think persuasively, that in terms of public opinion on intervention and so forth, there really hasn't been a long-term fallout from the war. The U.S. public is pretty much still divided, more or less evenly, on whether or not the war was a mistake. But I think, as our panel itself shows, and my own teaching experience would tend to demonstrate, so many Americans were either very young at the time of the war or not even born, that you wouldn't expect the war to have a kind of really powerful legacy, at least in the American imagination at this stage.
Thanks for that. Michael, I'm going to let you take a stab at that question if you want, but I'd also like to ask you, what was the debate like leading up to 2003? You said you were very much involved in it. So how would you describe it?
Thank you, Adam. And let me again express my appreciation to you and the Quincy Institute. And I like Steve's answer. I thought it's a very hard question, as he said. It was a nice, succinct answer. I'm sure he would agree with me that the human costs for American soldiers, diplomats, intelligence personnel, their families, and of course, Iraqis are also very high, and an important legacy of an operation that had a very, very difficult first 5 to 10 years, if not, let's say, up until today, still an ongoing, very unsettled Iraq. I would say, on balance, it's been a harmful intervention for American interests, more broadly defined, and for the state of the Middle East. I'm still hopeful there may come a day, if we have another event and you're good enough to invite me in 2033 or 2043, where perhaps Iraq has progressed enough in a way that Marcine herself eloquently expressed hope on our Brookings panel on this very topic last Friday. And she was not in any way, and she'll speak for herself in a second, she was not in any way trivializing the challenges that Iraq faces today. But those of us who still are hopeful that a democracy can solidify may hope that someday you can talk about benefits perhaps approaching costs, but the costs are enormous. And I think Steve was right also to make a point of emphasizing that the costs are higher, even in financial terms, than officially tabulated. The Watson Center has estimated as high as $4 trillion. I don't necessarily go along with that number, but I think the Watson Center and Steve are certainly right to talk about this being $2 trillion or more, if for no other reason than the Veterans Affairs costs that we're going to incur over the next generation as we take care of the wounded and the deceased, their families, I should say. And those costs can already be calculated more or less in actuarial terms. So the costs are very high. If there is a silver lining for U.S. grand strategy, and it's no more than a silver lining, we did show that as Americans, we can be pretty tough, staying with a difficult operation for a long time. Now, I know many scholars at Quincy would argue that we've been mistaken to undertake these long operations, and they've been strategic distractions. And there's a lot to be said for that perspective. But I think we also should recognize that this war maybe has not made us more liked around the world, but I think it has changed the perception of the post-Vietnam United States as somehow a paper tiger. That was a perception Osama bin Laden himself had, and many others after Beirut 1983, Mogadishu 1993, the Balkans wars being done exclusively with air power, the 1998 reprisal against the embassy bombings in Africa happening just with cruise missiles because we didn't seem to want to risk American lives. And I think we did show that we are tough as a nation. Now, again, I would not say that makes the costs worth paying. But I do think when you're doing a net assessment, that could be brought in as well. I went on long enough there, Adam, that I'll now be more brief on your question to me about the debate. The debate was not enough of a debate in the sense that, the Bush administration with 90% popularity after 9/11 and a very quickly successful operation in Afghanistan, surprisingly successful against the Taliban, was riding pretty high. A lot of Democrats had remembered the experience of how voting against Operation Desert Storm had cost a lot of Democratic senators and other prospective presidential candidates the standing they would have preferred in national politics, and didn't want to make that mistake again. So roughly half the Democratic caucus and most of the Republican caucus in both houses voted for the authorization in October 2002, and still hoping the authorization would be used as a threat against Saddam rather than an actual decision to wage war. As you know, the UN debate happened thereafter. The UN did not pass a second resolution explicitly authorizing the war, and Congress never explicitly asked President Bush to start and never declared war. So in that sense, there's this ambiguity. But the role I tried to play in the debate, I was not strongly on either side of pro or against, but I said, I tried to argue, if we do it, it's going to be hard. And maybe the signature thing that I wrote was with Phil Gordon, who's now Vice President Harris's National Security Advisor. Phil and I wrote the op-ed at the end of 2001 that provoked Ken Edelman in response to write his famous or infamous cakewalk op-ed, where he said this war is going to be easy. And Phil and I had said, there's a case for threatening this war and maybe even doing it, but you better expect that it's going to be hard. And it's going to take substantial numbers of US troops, many years. And up until the end, I was hoping that the threat of the invasion would persuade Saddam to let the weapons inspectors finally do their job. I'll finish on this point, which I think is also telling, Adam. One place where people did not really debate was the weapons of mass destruction issue. And it wasn't just Congress. It was even German intelligence, Canadian intelligence, UN inspection teams. Everybody thought if he's trying so hard to impede the inspectors, he must at least have chemical and biological weapons and maybe some remnants of a modest nuclear program. Although I think the Bush administration deliberately exaggerated the likely scale of that in order to make the case for conflict. But there was nearly universal acceptance of the idea that Saddam had WMD. Steve was correct that there were some voices, not very many, but some, warning that this war would be hard. And he was part of that very important and useful cautionary argument himself. But so on that issue, you did at least have some debate, not enough, but some. On the WMD, it was, in George Tenet's infamous phrase, more or less seen as a slam dunk. And in retrospect, that's obviously regrettable as well.
But Michael, if I could follow up with one point on that last point about WMDs, I mean, it's really difficult for the general public to have a debate about a fact or perhaps non-fact that the intelligence community and president asserts, because the general public doesn't have access to that information. And I can't help but think that the Iraq War was absolutely disastrous in terms of eroding public trust in the White House, in the US government, in our institutions, and we're still seeing the ramifications of that today. When people question something the US government says, whether it's security, public health, or anything else, they can point to this issue of WMDs, and they're not wrong.
You're correct. And I think that there should have been, there was some explanation of the methodology by which the intelligence communities of the United States and most other countries came to this incorrect conclusion. There should have been more explicit acknowledgement that most of it was based on inference, basically saying Saddam had WMD before. He even used WMD before. He fooled us with 3 secret underground nuclear programs through the 1980s we didn't even realize he possessed. He's been impeding inspectors ever since they went in after 1991. And therefore, we logically infer that he must still have something to hide, or he wouldn't be foregoing all this oil revenue. And then if you had at least been a little more explicit about that line of argument, it would have allowed a general public or strategists to then pick apart the argument as they saw fit and be a little bit less cowed into quiet by some belief the U.S. intelligence community must have hard information they just couldn't share with us because it was classified. So I take your point on that. It's well said.
Thank you for that. Marcin, so Michael talked about perhaps the benefits catching up to the cost someday in Iraq. And of course, all transformations in nations are, I don't want to say all, but many transformations in nations are violent by nature and involve in a high human cost. But it strikes me what's unique about the war in Iraq and the political order that emerged from it is that this wasn't really something in control of the Iraqi people, at least not in its beginnings. It was imposed on the Iraqi people. First, Saddam had been imposed on the Iraqi people, and then this invasion was imposed on the Iraqi people. So what is your, feel free to answer anything that's already been asked if you have thoughts, but what is your assessment about where Iraq stands today? Was it all worth it? What have been the benefits? What have been the costs?
I mean, it's a very somber day for everyone in Baghdad who remembers 2003 and remembers the immediate aftermath, which was a very violent time. And, there's been a lot of reflections on this. And I think some key themes that emerge is that we all agree that Saddam Hussein was one of the most brutal dictators in history, and there's no one who longs for him or misses him who truly has Iraq's interest at heart. But that being said, two wrongs don't make a right. And what followed him was also violent and brutal. But I don't like to compare the two. I think they're completely different conditions that the Iraqi people had to suffer under. I'm a very forward-looking person, though, and so if you'll allow me, my attitude towards the US invasion at this point is that it's happened, and I am much more concerned and interested in the future of Iraq, mainly because most Iraqis don't remember the 2003 war. Our population is very young. Most Iraqis were born after 2000, after 2003. For those who were even around during the Ba'athist era, they were children and don't really have a strong recollection of it. And really their formative years were that 2005 to 2010 era, which was rife with sectarian violence. And what this has created is a generation of Iraqis who have, rightfully so, high expectations of what a democracy looks like and have a deep distrust of sectarian and consociational systems that are built on sectarianism. And where this takes us is a young Iraqi population today that is, I would say, dissatisfied with the current political system that they have, but that has not given up entirely on democracy. There is the reformists in Iraq, there's the revolutionaries in Iraq, but Iraqis do think of themselves, Iraqi youth, as deserving of a system of government that represents them. And I think ultimately, that's a good thing if people have that goal. Briefly, there were times in which I was concerned about Iraq having authoritarian nostalgia, not for Saddam Hussein, but for the idea of a strong sovereign country that wasn't being transgressed upon by its neighbors constantly. And this is something that concerns Iraqis. If you talk to the average young person in Iraq today, their primary concerns are corruption, which is endemic in the country and which they see as sapping away its wealth and their futures. They're concerned with the lack of services, including healthcare, education, paved roads, things like that, just basic services. And they're concerned to a lesser degree with the issues that I think that catch more attention in the West, like the issue of security or stability, because Iraq has been, it's been a few years 7 years since the defeat of ISIS, and we have achieved some stability that we haven't seen before. I mean, keep in mind, after the 2003 war, we went into a sectarian civil war that destabilized the country, followed by the ISIS war, more destabilization. So this is the first time that we've actually had some time to breathe. And I'm hopeful that we have a few more years of stability to see how that will impact the political dialogue on the street. I've been telling a story a lot, and I'm really sorry if someone has heard me say this before, but I find it to be really reflective of where Iraqi youth are today when it comes to the invasion and to the former regime and all these things. I was visiting the Martyr Monument in Baghdad, and I said this at the Brookings event as well. And this is a museum in which various Iraqi civilians and military who were killed in various wars over the years are memorialized, and where people can come see their names or their photos and visit them. But there's a very big poster of Saddam Hussein that's a few people tall, essentially, where he looks defeated, and it says like the end of tyranny on it. And I just saw these waves of young Iraqi students pass by it, taking selfies of themselves in this space without even paying attention to this poster or even recognizing it. And I thought that, I took a photo of the entire scene thinking this is very symbolic of where Iraq is today.
Is that an opportunity then? You seem to be implying it as. I just want to make sure I'm understanding that correctly. We have this young population that absolutely abhors sectarianism because they experienced the worst of it during basically what could be described as a civil war. and they've moved past this sort of perhaps the weight of this history of the Saddam era and the sectarian era, and they want something better. Is that an opportunity, and how can can the United States take advantage of that opportunity in a way that's good for the US and Iraqis, or is it better for the US to back off and let Iraqis figure this out?
I mean, Adam, I'm going to be honest. I have concerns that the US doesn't care about democracy in Iraq. I think the US far values stability in an anti-Iranian Iraq than it does a democratic one. These are the kind of messages I seem to get when I'm discussing Iraqi politics or when I hear discourse on Iraq from Washington. I think it is time to ask the US, is it stability and an ally you're looking for against Iran, or is it democracy? Because democracy in Iraq will probably, a consolidated democracy in Iraq will reveal a dislike and a disinclination to engage deeply with both Iran and the United States. They both have a history of intervention in this country, but I don't know if people want to confront that yet. Yeah,
that's an interesting point. I remember when I was in Baghdad and I saw some of the Tishrini graffiti. They'll show both the Iranian flag and the American flag as them up against those flags. Now, of course, sometimes the Iranian flag is blacked out with black ink, but still, both flags, at least in the original graffiti, are displayed. So I'm going to go back to. Sorry, I muted myself. I'm going back to you for a moment, Michael, because you said something, I think, about 11 years ago. I just recently watched this video. It's actually on YouTube. It only says 11 years ago, so I don't know the exact date, but it's before the rise of ISIS. And you said it really is going to be politics that defines the success or lack thereof in Iraq. And you were talking about the future of Iraq. And in the context of what you were saying, you were basically arguing that, look, what the U.S. does or doesn't do militarily in Iraq is not going to be the defining thing, the defining decider, let's say, of the future of Iraq. It's going to be domestic Iraqi politics. And I actually have to agree with you there, because assuming you said this, before the rise of ISIS, at that time, it seems like there were domestic factors in Iraq that were perhaps creating the conditions for the rise of ISIS. And I'm wondering if you can reflect on that statement. I know you're hearing it out of context, and I can't provide an exact date, but if you can reflect on that statement now, a little bit over a decade later, with what you know, do you think it still rings true?
Thank you, Adam. I think it does. And I remember that period pretty well, because it was around 2010, 11, and I think the Iraqis had an important election in 2010, as I recall. It's actually the last time I've spoken personally to Joe Biden. He was vice president, and I think President Obama had given him the Iraq portfolio to take the lead on. And Biden was talking to a lot of people in the broader think tank community about how to handle this juncture in Iraqi politics. Of course, it was for Iraqis to make the decision, but we had a fair amount of influence. And Prime Minister Maliki was increasingly a sectarian problem. As we still had forces in Iraq, as you know, through the end of 2011, but we were planning to leave. And then there was the failure to agree on a legal basis for having our troops stay thereafter. So we were losing some of the influence we had previously. And this was then making Prime Minister Maliki, feel a little more free to essentially punish Sunni politicians, including some very good people, some people that were well regarded in the American diplomatic and security communities. Al-Asawi was one, for example, people who were reformers, who were not sectarian themselves, but Maliki was going after them, trumping up false charges, even sometimes capital charges of treason against them, and really looking to weaken his political opponents through hook and crook, rather than just try to defeat them at the ballot box. And then also we had this 5-way election. I won't try to get back into the detail. 5 main parties, as I recall, in Iraq, and the United States tried to weigh in on the outcome, because it was a question of who would get the first chance to try to build a coalition in this parliamentary system. And some people just wanted to stick with Maliki because they saw him as, like Marcin was just saying, it's hard to think of him as a force for stability, but at that point he was the devil we knew, at least. And then there was former Prime Minister Alawi, who was another important leader, probably should have been our preferred candidate, but we were still trying to interject ourselves into the Iraqi politics. I think we did stave off some of Maliki's worst instincts for a while, but as we then pulled out and gave up that final bit of leverage with our military presence, and then Maliki hardened his sectarianism and his cronyism, by the time you got into 2011, 12, 13, I think Iraqi politics were really off the rails. So in conclusion, I would say, obviously we're all debating, and most of us would probably acknowledge the Iraq war itself was way too costly for the benefits. But I would still argue by 2010-11, we had minimized our footprint enough that it would have been preferable to find a way to stay with a few thousand troops and use our military, economic, and political leverage to try to get Maliki to behave in a less sectarian fashion. I think we gave up some of that leverage and we saw the consequences. That's my overall recollection of that period.
But Michael, isn't it true that, I mean, they had tried to renegotiate a status of forces agreement and Maliki had been very resistant to that.
Yep.
And so, I mean, now you were probably much more present than I was at that time. So, I mean, it seems to me that they did want to keep a small footprint, but Iraqi politics precluded them from doing that. Am I wrong?
No, you're right. And Steve probably remembers this very well too, and Marcin, I'm sure, understands, even if she wasn't old enough at the time. But he probably understands it, could explain it much better than I. But yes, the Iraqi parliament at that, the U.S. popularity in Iraq has been bad ever since about 2004. It was pretty high in that first few months. But if you go back to the various gauges of how Iraqis view the United States, elites realized they might still need us. But public opinion had really soured by the time that the Iraq insurgency and civil war were kicking into high gear by 04, 05. And so you have the legacy of all of that, plus Iran's sort of hidden hand in Iraqi politics. And yes, it was pretty hard to say, or to ask the Americans to stay and to give us protection for our troops who might be arrested under Iraqi law. And we were insisting that they be tried under American legal system. So Iraqi politics probably couldn't have mustered a formal invitation. We could have tried to just extend the previous arrangement. But President Obama said, and I understand where he was coming from, although I disagreed, but I think what he said was, listen, if the Iraqis don't want us, it's time for us to go. And so he just tried to simplify it in those terms. And knowing full well that Iraqi politics probably couldn't find a way to invite us formally. And then, therefore, we left. So I think your memory is correct.
Thanks for that. I'm going to move on to Stephen now. Stephen, I kind of wanted to get your reaction about what Marcin said. She's asking the question, or she asked the question, does the United States want Iraq as a partner for security against Iran, or does it want a strong democratic Iraqi state, knowing full well that that might involve a little bit of anti-American sentiment, or at a minimum that might involve wanting to chart their own course that's not beholden to either Iran or Iraq. And in some cases, there might be some stakeholders in the society that are more aligned towards Iran and some that are more aligned towards the US. Is that the right question? And can the US do both, or does it have to choose a lane? I think you're on mute, Stephen.
Yeah, Adam, that's an interesting question, and I'd like to get into it in a second, but I think it's worth following up on a couple of points that were raised earlier. First, on the question of WMD in Iraq, I think it's essential to point out that essentially unimpeded, deeply intrusive and comprehensive inspections had been carried out within Iraq for 8 years following Desert Storm. And essentially nothing of any consequence was found. So while it is true that there were some in the intelligence community and certainly in the policy community who couldn't take yes for an answer, the fact is that the UNMAVIC, the UN inspection team that was running things in the latter half of the 1990s, judged that there just wasn't anything there. So connecting the WMD question and doubts surrounding it with the war that took place in 2003 is really a constructed non sequitur. There is no connection really between the two. Now, there was an asserted connection, of course, because the United States wanted to justify the war legally in terms of a response to a violation of UNSC 687, which was a ceasefire resolution from the earlier war. And WMD was the diplomatic coin of the realm. So if you were going to make progress in that sort of diplomatic arena, you'd have to pin your war justification on WMD. But the thing is that information certainly that's come to light since then, especially about communications between Powell, who was Secretary of State, and Jack Straw, who was his counterpart in the UK, have shown that they both understood that the WMD justification for the war was false. And Powell himself had been briefed extensively on this by his own intelligence apparatus in the State Department. So, the notion that the 2003 war was somehow a rational and sadly inevitable result of the inconclusive nature of WMD inspections in Iraq in the preceding years really doesn't align with the historical record. Simply doesn't. And I think, there's confusion on this score, in part because of the vast array of war justifications that had been advanced by the Bush administration leading up to the war in 2003 and then after it. So I think it's just really important to be clear on that and not see the war as somehow a necessary, if lamentable, consequence of failed inspections, because the inspections did not fail, and the war was not an inevitable consequence of the inspection process. And I think it's important to be firm on that accurate approach to the historical record. Now, the question, Marcine's, I think very good point. Well, does the United States really care about democracy in Iraq? Well, just bear with me for 1 minute. I have to. There we go. My Siri was intercepting our conversation. I had to put an end to that intrusion. So, Marcine, look, the United States thought that establishing a democracy in Iraq was going to be important because there was a trend in American thinking at that stage that democracies are good because democracies don't fight one another. Wars happened between democracies and authoritarian regimes. So from the perspective of this thinking, as I'm sure you know, as a political science professor, I feel a bit self-conscious, saying this to you of all people. But there was a belief that, well, if we get a democracy instituted and consolidated in Iraq, then we won't have to worry about Iraq being an aggressor in the future. And I think, there was certainly in the State Department, a strong view that democracy could be instituted in the wake of the overthrow of the Ba'athist regime. But the State Department never got a chance to do any of that. And the consociational system, this divide the spoils system of sectarian government that the United States saddled Iraq with, was, a brainstorm of the political appointee who was sent to Iraq in the wake of the military phase of the campaign to run the occupation, Paul Bremer. It was not an approach that had been widely coordinated within the United States government. Much was left to his discretion, and his instincts, as we know, were deeply flawed. His program of de-Baathification, which stripped the Iraqi state of whatever administrative capacity it still retained, the disbanding of the Iraqi army, which unleashed tens of thousands of young, unemployed people onto the streets of Iraqi towns and cities. These were all the idiosyncratic ideas of a particular individual whose leeway was virtually unlimited in terms of U.S. policy in those early days. And they set the stage. Those steps set the stage, of course, for what was to follow. So, I guess I'd say you're a person who said the United States wasn't interested in Iraq being a democracy could be both right and wrong at the same time. There was an impulse to create a democracy and a strategic justification for doing so, but there was an occupation that ran counter in practice to those democratically oriented policy objectives.
If I could ask a quick follow-up, though, Stephen. I mean, I think Marcin was really referring to today. I mean, so I guess I'd ask you, today, do you think U.S. policy is prepared to deal with Iraq as a complex democracy that, of course, is going to come up with legislation and policies and foreign policy positions that aren't necessarily aligned with the immediate U.S. interests or whatever we think the U.S. interests are? It's an independent state, and of course, sometimes it's going to take positions that are aligned with Iran. Sometimes it's going to take positions that are aligned with nobody. Is Washington ready to deal with that, or does Washington really want a client state that it can sort of control and bring into line when it wants?
I don't think that there are fantasies in Washington about Iraq being a client state. I mean, certainly, there was a vision, and I'm sorry, Adam, I will talk about the present day, but history is important here. There was a time before the war and just leading up to the war when there were those in the United States who did see Iraq as potentially the ideal client state. It had an advantage over Israel because it wasn't a Jewish state and could therefore have relations with other states in the Sunni world, certainly. And it wasn't Saudi Arabia, which was kind of a peculiar obscurantist country with a lot of problems of its own, certainly when it came to functioning as an American ally. So Americans looked at Iraq as potentially the perfect aircraft carrier, the perfect platform for the projection of U.S. power in the region. It was a secular state. Women were integrated into the economy, and it had a powerful army, and it was technologically advanced. After all, they had, as Michael was saying before, a nuclear program. So there was a thought that the war would lead to Iraq becoming a kind of muscular protege to the United States that would help the United States consolidate its position in the region. So yes, Marcin, there was that, but that has faded, to say the least. And I don't believe, certainly on the basis of my conversations in Washington and most recently in London at the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office, I don't think anybody's got any illusions about about Iraq being a kind of pliable client state to a powerful patron in the form of the United States. That's a fantasy that has evaporated with events. And I think that the US objectives are now much narrower. And it's to counterbalance Iran, principally, and prevent the return of ISIS. And they'd like to see Iraq embedded geopolitically and economically in the broader Sunni world. But that's a far cry from the dominant relationship suggested by, the patron-client paradigm. So that's not happening. Now, you could say the situation is even more complicated than that, because if you look at the Trump administration, they had a really strange approach to Iraq. The Trump administration didn't know whether Iraq was an ally or an enemy. And at the end of the day, they seemed to conclude that Iraq had basically already been irreversibly co-opted by Iran and could be treated as an adversary. And I think that was one of the underlying impulses to the attack on al-Muhandis and Soleimani back in 2020. There was a feeling that, well, you could just carry out those kinds of attacks because essentially Iraq was enemy territory. So you could do it. I mean, currently the Biden administration has a very different take. The U.S. officials who are involved in Iraqi policy at very high levels have a lot of experience in Iraq from the Obama administration, and they don't think of Iraq as as either a client state or an enemy for that matter. And I'll just close on that point by saying that the U.S. has now shifted the dialogue in the higher coordinating committee, that is the highest body that regulates on a consultative basis U.S.-Iraqi relations. They've now shifted it entirely to economic issues. Security is no longer a feature of the agenda. And the United States sees the stabilization of Iraq's political economy as being key to stability in the region, which in a broad sense is an American interest. But none of this suggests a kind of patron-client relationship.
Thank you for that, Stephen. Marcin, I'm going to go to you now, and I have two questions. The first question, being related to what Stephen just said, do you think, if indeed it's true that U.S. policy towards Iraq is shifting towards focus on economics and things like that, do you think that's the right move? And secondly, I know your PhD thesis was focused on the clergy and protests, and you've written a lot of articles and books related to clergy and their relationships with society. And what does the U.S. discussion get wrong and right about sectarianism in Iraq? And do we mistakenly think just because groups are Shia or communities are Shia that they're necessarily pro-Iran and things like that? Does that get oversimplified or reduced, in a way?
Adam, I'll start by saying that I don't have a single book published yet, but I really like the optimism, and I hope one day someone will tell me I have a lot of books and it will be true. But that aside, can I start with the question about the clerics first and sectarianism, because it ties into a few more points, and then I'll pivot back to the first question. So I focus on the Shia clerics in Iraq, and I think for anyone who's unfamiliar with them, which is understandable because, religion is quite complicated across the world, there's this assumption that they will mimic exactly what Iranian clerics are like, and if you let them have their way, you'll end up with a theocracy in Iraq that looks a lot like Iran. And there's a lot of fear of Shia Islamists in Iraq. There's a lot of fear of any, person with a turban in Iraqi politics. But that overlooks entirely how complicated clerical views towards politics are in Iraq. They fall along a spectrum in which many of them believe that their role in political life is simply to ensure stability. So they only intervene if the country is in a state of protest, revolution, civil war, something really destabilizing. But they don't see themselves as politicians, or they don't see themselves as having necessarily to be involved in the everyday political decisions in a country. So that makes Iraq a lot different from Iran. I will say that when it comes to Grand Ayatollah Sistani, for example, I don't think many Americans who mattered misunderstood his role. I think they understood who he was. So I think particularly when it comes to Shia clerics at that very high level, there was an acknowledgement of their authority and an acknowledgement of the role that they would have to play to ensure the buy-in of the Shia community, but also to ensure a smooth process of stability in Iraq, to ensure stability in the country. But I think for the layperson, there's always this assumption that they're going to be very close to Iran. They might bring theocracy. To be honest, even among the Iraqi public, there is not a fear of an Iranian theocracy, but a fear of clerics who aren't traditional clerics being part of the state and of bringing conservative values, or bringing various beliefs that don't resonate with I would say like a largely not secular but largely liberal youth. And there's a lot of pushback against that in Iraq right now. When it comes to the issue of sectarianism, it's such a thorny topic, and I can go on forever about it. But I think one thing that's important to raise, I saw one of the questions in the Q&A ask about whether sectarianism was in a way engineered after 2003 by the consociational system, or whether it existed before that. I think it's quite dangerous to say that sectarianism didn't exist before 2003, because that erases the experience of a lot of Iraqis who are victims of sectarian violence. I think what Saddam Hussein did differently is that he both acted in a sectarian way, but claimed that he was not sectarian in a way that I think it's hard for non-Iraqis to understand this. He made such a show of sectarianism being a taboo, while at the same time expressing very sectarian beliefs and actions. And the historic record is always there to show that he discriminated, and he killed large swaths of Iraqi communities. And I think it's quite dangerous to have this revisionist history of the Ba'athist era that I see sometimes being expressed online by Iraqis and by non-Iraqis alike. But as I keep saying, I would like to move on from the war and try to find a future in Iraq. But I think at the same time, we can criticize Saddam Hussein and say he was a terrible person with a terrible government without saying that the war was a good thing. I don't think these two things are incompatible, and I think more people need to start saying that. Obviously, the system that was imposed post-2003 did entrench sectarianism in a way that was different than to what Iraqis were accustomed to. It also brought groups to power who had never been in power before. It brought Shia opposition into power when they've never been in power in modern Iraq, or in the Iraqi state. It conceived of Iraq as needing to reconcile between these three distinct groups, and in a way ignored Iraq's cross-cutting cleavages that could have maybe produced parties that didn't exist on sectarian or identity baselines. And if we're going down this path, one question that honestly puzzles me to this day, and I think when I have more emotional energy to talk about how this war was conceived, Steve was talking about how, as political scientists, there's a democratic peace theory that democracies don't fight each other. Well, there's also so much political science information about how ethnic conflict comes about how long civil war lasts, about how easily things evolve. And it truly astounds me that there was so little insight at the time into how easily things can go back in a multi-ethnic society in which huge swaths of the population had been repressed. And just the lack of foresight in that way is something that I grapple with today. And I'm putting this out honestly. I don't have the answer. I just have this big question mark as why wasn't something that's so obvious to a first-year grad student in political science not obvious to the entire American foreign policy establishment?
That is an important question. Listening to this, I've thought of that we should have 10 more panels, and I've thought of 10 more topics of panels we should have, but we only have 4 minutes left. So I'm going to go around the virtual room here and ask, Steve, if you could take a stab at why it wasn't more obvious to the foreign policy establishment, that would be great, but don't feel any pressure. But what I really want to ask all of you is, what do you think the defining lesson, and you can apply it to whoever you want, whether it should be to the US foreign policy establishment, whether it be for Iraqis, whether it be for the American people, whoever you think you can speak for, what should be the defining lesson of this 20-year experience in Iraq so far? And I know that's a kind of a fourth grade question, but it's an important one, I think, if we can somehow distill it. Marcin, I'm going to give you the last word. So I'm going to start with Michael, go to Stephen, and then go to you, Marcin.
Thank you. So very quickly, I'm going to back up Marcin's point that understanding that when you cut off the head of the serpent, you don't create stability in a multi-ethnic society that's been decimated by war and misrule for decades. That should be probably lesson number one. And just one other small point, if I could, as I conclude, and I've greatly admired everything I've heard today, but just to give context on the WMD debate, and Steve will have a chance to rebut me if he doesn't like what I'm about to say. I think Steve's larger point that he made earlier is correct and convincing, that there's little reason to think by the years 2001 and 2 that Saddam had some big trove of WMD that we hadn't yet found, or that his nuclear program was secretly, near the enrichment of uranium to bomb grade. However, there was definitely an ongoing debate about whether he had WMD in the fall of 2002, as reflected, for example, in UN Security Council Resolution 1441, that gave him one last chance to disarm, that needed all 5 permanent members to support it to be passed. That same UN Security Council would not pass a second resolution in 2003, even after Colin Powell gave a speech that he always regretted, but that he believed at the time. He knew he shouldn't have believed the intelligence, that it was flimsy, but I don't think he was lying out it through his teeth, saying that there really were not, that he was claiming there were WMD when in fact he knew there weren't. So I think that debate was really alive and well up until the invasion. But Steve is right on the central point that we had spent a decade making sure this guy didn't have anything big. And therefore, whatever WMD remnants might have been there probably should not have justified this war.
And Michael, do you have a defining lesson? I mean, I know that's a specific lesson. Do you have any defining lessons?
Well, it's just Marcin's point, which I think Steve's about to speak to as well, because you asked him that when you go in and take out a bad guy, as bad as he may be,
okay, of course,
you should not assume that you're going to get stability just because people are relieved to have the dictator dead or gone.
You did say that at the beginning, so my mistake. Stephen, what about you? Stephen, I think you need to go off mute again.
If you insist. Look, I think the big lesson is that if a U.S. administration wants to go to war, they can do it. And the 2003 war, I think, really showed that. If you have an all-volunteer force, as we do, and you have a budgeting system that enables you to avoid going to Congress for supplemental appropriations to support operations. If you have authorizations for the use of military force that are quite sweeping from Congress, which the United States did have, you're free to do at that point really whatever you like. and for a long time. And I think the Bush administration proved that. The other big lesson is it's really hard to win wars. And, to fight wars for the purposes of buttressing your reputation, because you think it will prevent wars in the future, is deeply flawed thinking from my perspective. And I think Michael set out that school of thought, I thought, very eloquently, which was to say, well, listen, we fought this war and we've showed that we're tough. And by showing we're tough, our enemies won't attack us. But my understanding from traveling a great deal in the region, talking to many, many people, is that the widespread understanding of the US war in Iraq was that the US lost. And that's the more enduring perception. There was when Anthony Eden died, the British leader who engineered the 1956 war at Suez, died. The London Times had a very cruel obituary, which said that Eden was the last person to believe that Britain was a great power and the first person to prove it was not. And that obituary fits George W. Bush really, really well. Thanks.
Okay, well, I think that says it all. Marcin, I know you're in Baghdad and it's quite late for you, and we really appreciate you joining us today. So if you could give us the last word and close us out, anything you think that anyone should have learned from this.
I think something that applies for all conflicts is that it's never a black and white conflict, and to never think that you are fighting a fight against this all good or all evil that will result in an ultimate good, without realizing the cost that it has on people. And I know this has been said over and over again, and I don't consider myself an activist by all means, but I've seen the extraordinary cost on civilians, and I see this mistake being repeated over and over again, prolonging violence for no reason except to satisfy egos in different contexts. It's not worth it. Think twice before you drag children into war.
Well, on that very somber note, I have to thank all of the three panelists. I think we could go on another 2 hours. I think it probably deserves much longer than what we had. But I hope the viewers got a glimpse into this, the thinking of all three of you and the reflections that you have, which are all very important and from very different vantage points. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Kelly.
Thanks, Adam and Michael and Stephen and Marcin. It was wonderful conversation, and really appreciate all the time that you all were able to give us today.